and welcome. My name is Andrew Soren. I am the president of the MAPP Alumni Association. Thank you to at this particular moment, 177 of you who have joined us today. Wow, this is going to be a crazy, amazing, massive MAPP meetup. I'm just going to do a very, very quick little kind of show and tell of things that you should know about how we're going to use this period of time. So first of all, let me just talk about what the agenda is. We're going to have a fireside chat with Marty, Dr. Aaron Beck, Dr. Judith Beck, and maybe some other special guests. And that's going to be probably the first 45 minutes or so of this call. After that, we're going to do a panel Q&A. Where we will ask some of the questions that you've asked us already in the RSVP survey. And if there's other questions that you have as we go through, just feel free to put them into the chat and we'll be keeping an eye out. If we have time in the last probably third of this call, it lasts for 90 minutes in total, we'll try to do some breakouts and have an opportunity for some more intimate conversations, and then we will wrap up. Just some quick logistics. We are going to keep you on mute unless you are specifically talking, just to make sure that this is as effective as possible. We also really encourage you to keep your cameras on. If you go into gallery view, once we are done with the slides, it's really fun to just scroll through the pages and see the hundreds of Mappsters who are on. It's certainly a positive intervention just seeing your amazing faces. We would encourage you to use the chat to share ideas and to post questions. If you do want to speak, we ask you to raise your hand within the chat function or within the Zoom function. You'll be able to do that. If you are asking questions, be practically wise. Make sure that you keep your questions short so that we can make sure that the people answering them can have the most time to be able to answer them. And if you want, feel free to rename yourself so that your MAPP year or other affiliation is visible to everybody who's here. Just a quick note of gratitude. Thank you, Louis Alero and Darlene, for being our Zoom ninjas today. Jill Bell and Dana Fulweiler are going to be reporters to make sure that we capture everything and summarize it today. Robin Johnson and Jen Hausman have helped an enormous amount to synthesize all of the amazing information that you already posted in the RSVP. And I just want to especially call out Meng Fu, our incredible chair of the MAPP Alumni Social Committee, who has been doing heroic efforts to make sure that all of these meetups happen. I will speak more about that soon, but I first want to just throw it over to Marty so that you can just introduce the folks who are going to be on the phone and start the conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Good. Well, welcome to a historic session. I think this is a session that we can tell our grandchildren about. It's my great pleasure today to have us start off with Tim Beck. Tim and I have been meeting for lunch, about once a month for the last 20 years. And I've now made it to 77, and Tim has made it to 98. And so we're going to have our lunch session today with some 200 of you. And the session today will start off with Tim and with Judith Beck as well. Judy is the head of the Beck Institute, and we've got Karen Rivich and Judy Salzberg here. We've got Hal Urban here as well. So Tim and Judy will talk for a bit, and then they'll take your questions, and then I'll talk for a bit. I have something new to say. This is the first time I've ever endorsed the smiley face, and I'll talk a bit about that. So without a further introduction, except to say that Tim comes from Aaron Beck's middle name, Temkin, but I've known him all my life as Tim. So Tim, it's a great pleasure to have you here at our lunchtime meeting.
So first of all, I am very happy, as you see my smiley face, to be here and to talk to this Alumni Association, plus a number of people from the Beck Institute And also my two assistants are here. That's Victoria and Molly. I thought you might be interested, and Marty would be interested in this too, as to how I first met Marty. And this was in the basement of Joe Wolpe's house. Now, for those who don't remember Joe Wolpe, he was the pioneer in behavioral psychology. And at that time, I wanted to find out as much as I could about behavioral psychology. So I got myself invited, and Joe used to remark that I was the most intelligent intelligent Freudian that he ever met. And so how I got the mark of a Freudian is because I went through the usual routines in psychoanalysis. And then I tried to apply the theory of psychoanalysis to dreams. And I remember that I applied for admission to the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and they turned me down because they felt that anybody who had to do research on psychoanalysis to prove that it was valid obviously needed more psychoanalysis. So they recommended that I spend 4 more years on the couch. And that was enough of an impetus to push me over to psychology. At that time, when Joe Wolpe was meeting, I presented my material on masochistic dreams. And what I attempted to demonstrate with the aid of a psychology graduate student by the name of Marvin Ravitch, was that depressed people had more masochistic dreams than non-depressed people. And I presented this material, and then a young man with curly hair got up, and he said that this was very valid because I had one line for the 14 patients who had masochistic dreams in the depressive condition, and then there were 14 matched controls who were not depressed. And these 2 lines never overlapped. And I asked for this person's name, and I found out that he was none other than the person who founded positive psychology. And since that time, I have tried to keep up contact with Marty Seligman, who was a graduate student at that time in the Department of Psychology. And it's hard to believe that how many decades have passed since then. And then Marty went to Cornell. And as you know, Cornell went through a number of big upsets, mostly of a political nature. And I suspected that Marty might be vulnerable to being recruited. So I talked to our chairman, Mickey Stunkard, and we arranged to have Marty come down as I think as assistant or associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And then eventually he merged over to psychology. The Department of Psychology in those days had a policy of not hiring anybody who had been graduated from their program, because the program was so good that any graduate would be sure to go to Harvard or some other place. And ever since then, Marty and I have kept up our contact. And then about 20 years ago, we started meeting on a monthly basis. And I found that very rewarding. So that's the story.
Marty, do you wanna kick off with any questions for Dr. Beck? Marty, can you hear me?
Oh, it's great to hear about it.
Great.
This was 54 years ago, when the meetings at Joe Wolpe's house took place. But I thought it was the living room in my and not the basement.
Oh, okay. I guess that was my tribute to the unconscious.
Well, Tim was my teacher then, and he is my teacher now. And I think he and Judy have some wisdom to share with you about anxiety and depression, particularly during this pandemic. And so let's turn it back over to Tim and Judy to share some of their thinking about what's going on now and what we should be doing.
So anyhow, I reviewed some of the questions, about half a dozen of the questions, and there was one question that I double-starred that was of particular interest to me. Anyhow, this question had to do with what does positive psychology have to contribute to cognitive therapy? And this is the first time I have a platform or a speech I want to make. And so for a long time, I've been studying psychology, not as a student, not as a formal student, but as an outsider, because I never really took a course in psychology. And so I studied experimental psychology and biological psychology and cognitive psychology and personality, evolutionary psychology. And I came to the conclusion that each of these approaches is correct, but it's also wrong. And what's wrong about each approach is that it takes up just a small segment of the individual, and the individual is a whole person. And incidentally, in therapy, we also draw on the conclusions of the Enlightenment, which draws on, which applies to humanistic psychology. So in our approach to human beings, we have to think of the person as a unit. And while it is possible to look at it in terms, look at the person in terms of the biology or the psychology or the evolutionary antecedents and so on, you have to mold them all together, and you have to look at the individual as a person who is a composite of everything. And that's where positive psychology molds with the negative psychology of cognitive therapy. And this is one of the big faults of cognitive therapy, which we have tried to remedy in the past 10 years. And that is that cognitive therapy was based mostly on the errors that individuals make in their thinking. And incidentally, all their thinking is not wrong. In fact, it's only a small proportion of the thinking because for the most part, even if we are psychotic, for the most part, we go about our affairs in a perfectly rational, reasonable, realistic way. But there are certain situations in which we have errors in our thinking. And being influenced by humanistic psychology, I wanted to apply the rules of the Enlightenment to these kind of errors that people make. And the techniques we use were the techniques of reasonable, of reason and rationality and experimentation. And so I drew on a little bit of cognitive psychology and formulating my thesis, and I drew heavily on experimental psychology and the approach. But about 10 years ago, we started working with hospitalized psychotic patients, and I realized that the cognitive psychology I was using really missed the boat. And what we needed to do with our psychotic patients is to look at the positive aspects. And we found that when we got a patient who was very obsessed with his delusions and hallucinations and got him to talk about something that was meaningful to him and got him to do things that were meaningful to him, that the delusions and hallucinations receded into the background. And so we tried to activate the humanistic part of his psychology. And we did this through trying to provide opportunities for him to engage in altruistic activities. Helping other people was extremely important, or other kinds of meaningful activities. And these then had the result of reversing the extremely negative self-concept to a positive self-concept. And when they had the positive self-concept, their negative voices tended to recede into the background, and they no longer had the grandiose delusions that they had. And this brought me to the point where I realized that up till now, up till 10 years ago, I had missed the boat in segregating each approach to psychology into a unit by itself. And I started to mold everything together. And I think that I now have a much more humanistic and holistic view of the person. And that this is the basis for therapy now. So I'd like to, Judy has observed this transition in my thinking, and I'd love to hear her take on it, and also Monty's.
So I've really shifted in my treatment of clients as a result of this kind of revolution that my dad and his colleagues who were at Penn, who are now at the Beck Institute, have made. So I have a different approach to clients now. This is Paul Grant and Ellen Inverso and their team, who work primarily with hospitalized individuals who are diagnosed with serious mental health conditions, now head up our program for what's called recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And I've been translating that into how do you might approach clients who are outpatients, who are relatively much more highly functioning than the people they've been working with who may have been hospitalized for the last 15 or 20 or 25 years. So I'd just like to say a few remarks about that. So I had been approaching this shift for a long time. I didn't really have an organizing principle for it until I started really studying more about this recovery orientation. But one of the first things that we start with now with clients, or do more of, we've always done some, but do a lot more of, is talking about their values, what's really important to them in life. And then finding out what are their aspirations, how do they really want their lives to be? How do they want to be different as a result of treatment? And then at every session, we've been putting much more of the focus on the positive. So while we still keep track of symptoms, we don't pay too much attention to symptoms because that's the negative bias. But we start off sessions by saying, what is your sense of well-being this week? Say on a 0 to 10 scale, and then compare it to previous weeks. And we find out from the client, instead of saying, what problem do you want to work on when we set the agenda, we tend to say, what's your goal? Or what's your goal for today's session? Or what's your goal for the coming week? And so it's more positively oriented. And so the agenda items tend to be goals, which are just the flip side of problems. So the problem is that I'm terribly anxious about the COVID-19 crisis, a client might say. And so the goal would to have their sense of well-being. And as we are talking about the goals, we talk about some specific steps the client could take this week to achieve the goal. And then we start talking about what could get in the way of achieving the goal. So perhaps the goal might be to focus my attention when I'm with my children on things that they're interested in and not be so bombarded by negative thoughts that are fairly catastrophic in mind about the future. So I might teach the clients certain mindfulness techniques or other techniques. In identifying these challenges, we're looking for automatic thoughts that could get in the way. We're looking for practical problems that might need to be solved. And we're also looking for some skill deficits that the client might have. So we're using all of the same CBT kinds of techniques, but in the service of what's coming up in the coming week, as opposed to looking back and talking about the problems of the past week. Now, oftentimes, the problems of the past week are going to show up as impediments or challenges to being able to take the steps that they want to take this coming week. So that we do carry that forth in that way, but it's a much more forward-thinking way. And I'd just like to give you an example with a client. I had a client who had been in a different kind of therapy for 20 years, actually with the same therapist the whole time. And I think the therapy had helped her in some respects, but she was really very held back in life. She was just plagued with thoughts about how people in her past had misused her, had ill-treated her, hadn't respected her, and so forth. And she was just mired in this kind of negative thinking. She came in one session and I said, what's your goal for today's session? And she put her head down. She was thinking for a little bit, and she said, well, I guess I have to be honest with you about the terrible pain that I've experienced in my life. And I said, oh, well, that does sound very important, but can I ask you this question? How would you like to feel when you come in next week? And she said, well, I'd like to feel happier. I said, oh, that's great. Excuse me, let me write that down. How else would you like to feel? Well, I like to feel like I accomplished something. Oh, that's another great one. Let me write that down. How else would you want to feel? Well, I guess I want to feel more in control. Oh, very good. And do you want to feel more competent? Oh, yes. Would you like to feel more self-confident? Oh, yes. So would it be all right if we could now talk about just one step you could take this week that might move you in the direction of how you want to be feeling next week? So that's kind of in contrast to what I might have done in the past to find out what bothered her the most about her history, what was on her mind the most, and probably trying to do some cognitive restructuring about what went on. So that's a shift toward the positive that that all of our therapists, both the recovery-oriented ones and our kind of regular expert CBT therapists, I see Norman Cotterill is here today too, have been making, is this emphasis on values and on aspirations and on seeing the positive in life instead of focusing on the negative.
Do you mind if I jump in quickly with a question? We've had a lot of people in the chat, first of all, just saying, first of all, how thrilled they are to be able to see both of you embracing this notion of the positive, but also a turn to a very solution-focused, goal-oriented way of thinking about therapy. So lots of applause in the chat and excitement for that. One specific question that we've heard a lot, especially in the RSVPs, was about just this period of time that we're in right now, where there's so much fear and anxiety that is in many ways very legitimate fear and anxiety about what's going on. And so a question that from both of your perspectives, what might be the single most impactful intervention those within this community might be able to offer to people to just grapple with some of that fear and anxiety for people who are in their lives?
So Julie can tackle the fear and anxiety aspect. I have a general recommendation that I make to people, and that's to turn adversity into an opportunity. And this is an unusual opportunity to reset your priorities. And I think of a pie chart and have the people talk up in the ideal world, under ideal circumstances, how they would like to spend their time and how they would like to be invested into. And it's interesting how the professionals, particularly who are really obsessed with getting books out or writing papers or seeing more patients or whatever, how they take to this. And among the priorities would be spending more time with your family, be a good role model for your children and grandchildren, and have them call their grandfather and grandmother occasionally, and do all the good things for the community and good things for other people that they have always wanted to do. And by resetting the priorities, they stimulate this kind of positive feeling, which may be a more enduring thing than just the smiley face that Marty was talking about. If they can first get a smiley face and then an enduring happy mood after that.
That sounds good to me. So I'll tell you about one technique. I'd like to tell you about 50 different things that people can do, but I'll just say one that people might or might not be familiar with. And by the way, this new approach in CBT is what I've just finished writing about, and it's going to be in the 3rd edition of CBT Basics and Beyond, which comes out in the fall, along with this technique. One of the problems that
should really be a new book because there's so much stuff that's new in it that people might think the 3rd edition is just going to be a remake of the 2nd edition.
And there's also going to be a new book out on recovery-oriented cognitive therapy by Paul Grant and Ellen Inverso and other authors, including my dad, that's coming out probably at the late summer, early fall, that talks about how to really help people with serious mental health conditions. Anyway, here's the technique, or here's the rationale. People are so wrapped up in the moment. How can I keep myself safe right now? Or how can I keep my family safe And then also thinking about the next few months. And it is very hard to live with uncertainty. I think for most people, other people who are anxiety prone, it's really hard to live with uncertainty. And there is so much uncertainty, realistic uncertainty for all of us. But they can be bombarded by these thoughts over and over and over again. So what I do is to again, if I haven't done it recently, would go back and ask people, and my dad was talking about this a moment ago too, about what's really important to them in life. What are their highest values? And then I ask them to imagine a day, say 5 years into the future. So we've had the vaccine for 4 years. We've had no more pandemics because we've learned from this one. Things have gotten back to some new normalcy, say for at least 3.5 years or so. So it's 5 years into the future. We've had this new normal for the last 3.5 years. And I ask them to imagine in their mind's eye, as I ask them these questions, where would you like to imagine that you wake up? Is it where you are now? Is it in the same city? Is it in a different place? Whom do you want to imagine is in your apartment or in your house with you when you wake up? How do you want to imagine you're going to be feeling when you wake up? What do you want to be thinking when you wake up? What would you do first? The first thing when you got out of bed? What would you like to see yourself doing next? What would you like to see yourself doing next? And I have them paint a picture for themselves, a realistic picture of what life might be like 5 years from now, from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep. And we make sure, I make sure to ask questions that will embody their values. So, you know, you've said how important music is a part of your life. How would you like to imagine that you might have music in your life in this one day 5 years from now? Or you've said it's so important for you to be able to help other people. What could you inject into your day that would make you feel good about helping others? And so when you get people to imagine, instead of just talk, when people talk, they're usually their rational mind is turned on. When they imagine, their gut level sense or that emotional level sense is turned on. And when you do a technique like imagine yourself 5 years in the future, if someone can't, they go to 10 years in the future, if they still don't think the world's going to be back to a new normal. When they imagine it, then it hits them at the emotional level. And you can see as you're asking questions and helping them go through the day that their affect lifts. And it's so important. And I think he was talking about this. I can't remember whether it was when you were all tuned in or before that, but it's very important to have our clients experience positive emotion right in every session itself.
There's very active, lots of activity in our chat, lots of connection to everything that you're both talking about, and especially this question of what kind of life would you like to be able to have when all of this is done? Emma Judge says that apparently there's some new data in the UK that in a survey, only 9% of people who responded to this survey want to return to their life as it was before, which of course raises really big questions of what do they want to change and how they can be supported, and how that forces us to take us back to what a new normal might be. So I think all the questions you're asking are fascinating. Marty, do you have any questions that you want to ask of Dr. Beck?
No, I really want to turn it over to the 220 of us who are watching. I get plenty of opportunity to talk to Tim. This is special for the rest of you.
Well, I think that there's, I'll start again from some of the questions that have been posed before this session. So another question that I know that that people were very keen to be able to hear about is in relation to, I'll stick with the context of the pandemic, in relation to specific populations. And some of the populations that people described in the questions were essential workers, or isolated elders, or teens who might be feeling really isolated right now. Are there specific suggestions that you have to support and help any of those particular populations?
Sure. So, well, probably the most important is social connection. And I should really say meaningful social connection. So one of the things that I did, I have a son with special needs who lives alone in his own apartment, and is feeling really isolated. And since both my husband and I did catch COVID-19, we couldn't be with him. So one of the things that I did was to email many of our relatives on both sides of the family, extended family, and ask them to set up FaceTime calls with my son. And that made a huge difference. And they started to do it on a regular basis. So he would know that twice a week he was going to talk to his great aunt and my first cousin, for example. That's one of his favorite phone calls. But so helping people with meaningful social connection, I think, is probably one of the most important.
That's a wonderful suggestion, by the way. I didn't realize that you had done that.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Do you have other ideas? You want me to say anything else?
Sure. I think with our patient population who are inpatients, we have in a typical day when we walk into the day room, they'd all be lying on a couch, listening to voices, or in the worst case, they'd be walking around naked. And what's interesting is how they get transformed overnight, get transformed in a couple of minutes if you have them doing something that fits into their deepest desires, which happen to be inactive at the time. And so we encourage sociality, and we find that this has a transforming effect on them. Now, what do you do when you are in a position where the people have to be quarantined and they do not have any interpersonal connections? And so, as it happens, for reasons I don't quite understand, these people do not have computers, but they do have telephones. And what we do is we encourage them to call up, or we encourage their families to call them, and we encourage their children and grandchildren, and necessarily the great-grandchildren, so they'll keep up some social connection. And there was one other thing I wanted to add. It sounds as though this do-gooding that Judy and I are advocating is an antidote to the negative thinking. And it actually turns out to be true. That we did some research and we found that when people get better, they score higher on the optimism test and lower on the pessimism aspect of the hopelessness scale. And they also show more positive thinking as opposed to the negative thinking. And it seems to me that we'll have to test this out, that there's a kind of a seesaw. And so when the positive thinking gets activated, the negative thinking goes down. So to come back to the question of the sociality, any way in which you can encourage sociality in these people through telephones or through the internet or through correspondence, writing to one another, the more that they're going to think positively and the less they'll think negatively.
This gives me a good transition to chime in with what I've been thinking is so important that positive psychology and cognitive therapy might teach us about this time. As for sociality, the gallery view, so I have a gallery view of more than 200 of you. And so this for me, the question, I ask myself the question, is this heaven? I'm looking at so many people that I love and I like. And the answer is no, it's Zoom. It's not heaven, but it's very close for sociality for me. So what I've heard today from Tim and Judy and from the chat is one, during this epidemic, there's a chance to ask ourselves what is really important in our lives, to change our priorities, and to ask us what kind of a future do we want. Second thing that I'm hearing is the importance of sociality, and this is itself a wonderful example for me. A third thing is kindness. This is an opportunity to do kindnesses for many people. Now I want to turn to a new thing that I'm thinking. And this was set off by Hal Urban, who's here with us. So about 3 days ago, Hal's writing a book about positivity. I hadn't met him before. And he asked me the question, what good it might do to bombard yourself with good news and with positive moments now. And I had to step back when he asked me that, because I've been so turned off by the smiley face over the years that the notion of having a lot of positive moments didn't seem very meaningful to me compared to optimism and sociality and doing a kindness. But sitting at home now for 6 weeks with 4 of my kids, my wife, and 4 dogs, and listening to moments of bitching and moaning versus moments of positivity has really gotten me thinking about Hal's question. Now, the first thing to acknowledge is it's very difficult during times like this to spontaneously generate positive thoughts. And so importantly, this is difficult because what I'm going to be suggesting is maximizing positive moments, realizing how difficult it is. But importantly, I'm reminded of the story of psychiatric facilities at the Blitz in 1940. So many of you probably know that when the Blitz began, the British psychiatric establishment predicted there would be 3 million psychiatric casualties. And they ringed is probably the right word, London with psychiatric emergency facilities when the Blitz began. Tim, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'm saying you're accurate in the use of the term ring. They did have facilities surrounding London. But go ahead.
Yeah. So the surprising thing was after 3 months, they closed up because there were no psychiatric casualties. Very interesting about wartime and perhaps about a pandemic, that people start marshaling other resources. In the case of the Blitz, it was having a common external enemy. In the case of a pandemic, we're just finding out now. So let me suggest a resource that we should be doing during the pandemic. And it's the answer to Hal's question about what good is it not to bitch and moan, but rather to bombard yourself with as many opportunities for positive moments. What good do positive moments do? And so here was my answer to Hal, and Hal may want to chime in as well. So first, positive moments produce good vagal tone, lots of parasympathetic relaxing activity, activity that antagonizes anxiety, depression, and anger. From Barb Fredrickson's work, we know that bursts of positive films block and shorten negative ruminations. Positive moments lead to more zest. Positive emotion helps in getting us started doing things. And last week I talked about Sheldon Cohn's work on positive affectivity as a possible preventive of viral infection. And finally, positive moments are fun. So my recommendation during the pandemic is the smiley face. We bought a new puppy. The puppy's 12 weeks old now. There are lots of things one can do when one is tempted to bitch and moan to conjure up positive emotions. So my feeling, Tim and Judy, right now is that in the next 4 weeks, 12 weeks of isolation, each of us should find ways to maximize the amount of positive emotion we have in our lives. When this ends, and as Lincoln said, this too will pass, that's when resilience and optimism are going to matter for rebuilding. So Hal, I wanted to say I'm grateful to you for making me think about the smiley face again and about the importance of P in PERMA. So I wonder, Hal, if you might say a few words about your thinking about a positive emotion.
Yeah, first of all, let me say I'm really excited and honored to be part of all this. It came about by me asking Marty if he would answer a question because I'm writing a book and I wanted to have a voice of authority. And the book is actually about not so much just positive moments, but positive information going into your brain. The working title of the book is The Good News Effect, and then the subtitle is something along the line of what putting positive information in your mind does for you. And so that's what the whole thing is about. And I wanted to get a few people who are well known to tell me what do they see as the benefits of putting positive information into your brain. Many years ago, more than 30 years ago, I heard a speaker who was not a psychologist, but he said, you are what you are because of what goes into your mind. And we talk a lot about positive thinking and doing positive things and positive moments, but there isn't a real lot of information out there about making it a daily habit to put positive information into your mind. And I have been doing that for many years. It kind of started accidentally. I was a teacher and we used to do current events every day, and all the kids said, God, the news is bad all the time. All it is bad news. And so we decided to start every class with sharing good news just to get class off to a good start. And once the kids got into it, and I did this with adults too. I was an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco for 36 years, and I did it with them too. And they just loved it. I said, what's going good in your life? And they loved talking about it. They loved sharing it. It rubbed off on other people. And it was phenomenal. And I've had my former students, some of them now in their 60s, who have been asking me for years, you've written other books. When are you going to write about good news? And so finally I did it. So again, the idea is input the positive, put positive things. You don't have to be around people. You can go to the internet and you can find all kinds of good news. And that's why I think people like the woman down in Southern California, her name is Jerry, I think, Jerry Weiss-Corbly, and she started the Good News Network. And Ariana Huffington the HuffPost has a good news thing. And so that's kind of a long answer. But anyway, thanks, Marty. I really appreciate being with you.
I'd like to jump in here. and add to what you just said, Al. And it's not just the good things that happen to you, but what is the meaning of these good things? That's very important to nail down the meanings of things, particularly with our clients. So to give you an example of what I mean, so we ask our patients what they would like to have in their life when they get out of the hospital and they rejoin their families and the community and so on. What are their real aspirations? And so one patient said, well, his real aspiration is to be a great playwright. And the therapist then said, so what's good about being a good playwright? He said, well, there are things that you can do that will entertain people. You'll be doing something worthwhile. Other people who respect you will be creative. And he listed a dozen things that were meaningful about being a great playwright. But it was obvious to the therapist that he was never going to be a great playwright. So the therapist said, well, that would be an ultimate thing, but here you would like to entertain people, you'd like to be creative, you'd like to do something worthwhile, you'd like to be respected by other people, you'd like to bring enjoyment into their lives. What could you do in the meantime that would satisfy all those meanings? And the person said, well, I suppose I could be a stagehand. And he did get a position as a stagehand. And in this position, he was asked, what are the feelings you have about being a good stagehand? And he said, well, it makes people happy. It makes me happy. I'm entertaining people. I'm worthwhile. I'm creative, and so on. And so it was the meaning of the event rather than the event itself that was so important.
From what Tim says, it occurs to me there is a gift that I would like to get from some of you and maybe share it with others. And that is, I wonder if some of you who I know so well could make a series of YouTube clips, great music, great moments, a series. See if you can design a set of YouTube clips that bring many positive moments to others. I'd like to have that and start going through it.
There's been some really wonderful comments all throughout the chat as you have been describing all of this that I'll just recap some of. So one of the things that especially folks within Europe have been telling us on the call is just how much of a positive emotion burst the clapping at 8 p.m. every night is for all of the healthcare workers within the community, specifically in the UK, in Spain, in Italy, and several other places. I know that in New York, they've been starting to do it too. And that burst of positivity, I think, connected to the meaning, as you've just described, Dr. Beck, and especially to that kind of pro-social connection probably is important too. There's lots of other people who have talked about the positive news that they're starting to see, whether it's the BBC ending broadcasts with good news. Thank you, Vanessa, for that call out. People have specifically called out Henry Edwards, your book on kind of the good news and good things. New York Times publishing articles on kind of good news reports. So lots of different places where they are seeing good news. And yeah, there's so many comments. It's too hard to be able to pick, but we'll make sure that we summarize some of them too. Lots of love around this notion of positive portfolios and finding different ways to be able to share positive portfolios in different ways. So I want to probably shift the conversation a little bit and create an opportunity for us to have more intimate conversations in the last half of an hour. Before I do, Dr. Beck, is there any last words that you'd like to give to the group?
Yeah, so I'm glad to have this audience, because one of the misconceptions about cognitive therapy that I've heard for the last 60 years is that cognitive therapy tends to be artificial, that it is not emotional, it's not positive, and it neglects the doctor-patient relationship or the interpersonal relationship with a client. And I want to go on record as saying all those things are wrong. And this idea that cognitive therapy is just a manualized set of techniques is a total misrepresentation of what we do. And I think what we do does incorporate much of the positive, and it's going to incorporate even more as time goes on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Beck. Dr. Judy Beck, do you want to say any last words from your perspective?
Yes, just to pick up from what Marty was saying, I think it's really important for everybody, whether there is a pandemic or not, every day of his or her life is to train themselves to pay attention to the small positive moments during the day. Our attention often is drawn to the negative, and perhaps that had a survival purpose back when we were cavemen. So I think it takes a concerted effort to wear a different set of glasses throughout your day and recognize, it's not enough to have positive moments. You have to recognize that they're positive, and then you have to remember them in some way. So I tell everybody I know to get an online diary app. There's one that I particularly like, where you can take pictures and also have texts, write in text, and keep track of these positive moments that you have every day. And then you have this photographic record as well as a written record when you need to go back and perhaps re-experience some of those positive moments because your current moment is not that great.
Judy, what's the name of that app?
That one, there probably are a lot of them. And when I got it years ago, it was free. So I don't know if it still is. It's Day One, D-A-Y, and a separate word, O-N-E.
Thank you. We've had a couple of different Mapsters too who've been telling us about various apps that they are creating. Ming, I know that you've been developing an app that basically uses Bixby, which is the Samsung version of Siri. And I think you've possibly also been developing a Siri version 1 too, that gives people actually CBT-like prompts for people on an automatic automatic period of time throughout the day. I know that there's at least one other app too that was described, which we'll make sure that we promote. There are so many more questions. There are so many more questions that that we don't have time to answer. But what Dr. Beck has kind of very generously agreed is that if we send him a list of our top questions, he'll try to maybe answer some of them on his own time as well, and we can make sure we get that back to the community. So so that's, I think, one of the things that we can do